Good morning, my friends. I'm here to read chapter 41 of our story. Now, Eudora said, do get up, Jack. May will soon find herself in quite a bit of trouble, if I am not mistaken. We must hurry. Jack picked himself up off the snow floor and dusted himself off before something occurred to him. Miss Eudora? Ma'am? He asked shyly. How did you know my name? May's grandmother patted his cheek, smiling gently. I knew you were coming, dear. I've been waiting for you for a long time. She glanced down at the sword in his hand. And yet you still managed to surprise me. She glanced at him fondly, and he blushed. Now, she said, let's go rescue that granddaughter of mine, shall we? As May's grandmother, Eudora, moved to climb the stairs, Jack couldn't help notice how her time in the dungeon had seemed to weaken her. He could see it in her every step, in each move she made. As they started up the stairway, he silently offered her his arm, which she took with a slight nod. You're quite a little gentleman, aren't you, dear? She said to him, and he smiled politely, even if he'd have normally argued the point. Though Jack never would have believed it of himself, he was completely at a loss with this woman. Her presence was just so powerful. With Jack's help, the two managed to make it most of the way without too much delay. However fast they went, though, it wasn't nearly fast enough for Jack. We might still be quite a distance, Your Majesty, Jack said, as they paused for a moment's rest. Maybe I should just run ahead if May's in trouble. Eudora shook her head, breathing harder than he'd have liked. You alone are simply not enough, she told him. I need to be there as well, but I am still weak. Abruptly, she stopped and looked Jack up and down, as if sizing him up. It occurs to me, though, that there are other options. If you're a willing child, I could use some of your youthful strength. Just enough to give me energy to deal with these matters. Nothing you'd miss for too long, of course. Whatever you need, Jack said, without even thinking about it. Such a pleasant boy, the woman said, with a sympathetic smile as she reached out a hand to touch Jack's cheek. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then out of nowhere, Jack almost fell to his knees. All of his strength, his energy, seemed to be flowing right out of his chest and into Eudora's hand, which burned the skin over his heart as if it were on fire. Spots began to pop in front of Jack's eyes, and the bright white of the snow walls began to blur. But just as he thought he would black out, May's grandmother removed her hand. The drain on his energy stopped immediately, and whatever was left flooded throughout his body. Jack fell to the stairs and took a deep breath, waiting until his head stopped pounding to get back up. Within a few seconds it did, and other than the tiredness deep in his bones, Jack didn't actually feel too horrible. Everything seemed a little less bright in the palace now, but other than that, things hadn't changed much. May's grandmother, though, looked as if she'd dropped a few years off her age. Thank you, dear, she said, her eyes burning brightly. I apologize for doing it, as I'm sure it wasn't pleasant, but as I said, you'll recover quickly. Meanwhile, I believe it is time to find my granddaughter. With that, Eudora strode up the rest of the stairway and down the subsequent hallway, leaving Jack out of breath and struggling just to keep up. With Eudora leading the way, they quickly found themselves back in the room with 3 doors. Just as they passed through the doorway into the room, though, something very large and very green came flying past them to slam into the wall just a foot or 2 from Eudora. The green object slid down the wall to the floor, still breathing, but just barely. It was the huntsman. From the hall leading to the courtyard, the Wolf King walked into the room in his human form, grinning his wolfish grin. The animal was breathing hard, and his left arm was hanging limply at his side, but otherwise he looked fine. That was invigorating, the wolf said. He approached Jack and Eudora, then dropped to one knee in front of May's grandmother. Your Majesty, he said in a low voice, we have missed you. Oh, do get up, my friend, she said to him. You honor me too much. The wolf stood back up, the grin still locked on his face. Jack hadn't even ever seen him look so happy. You have no idea what this means to me, Your Majesty, the wolf said to her, shaking his head as if in disbelief. She curtsied to him. I'm pleased to see you as well, Your Majesty. However, we're on our way to find my errant granddaughter and have little time for pleasantries. Please do accompany us. By the by, you have my gratitude for bringing her to me. It was my pleasure, the wolf said. And now we are 3, May's grandmother said. Which door did my granddaughter go in, Jack? Jack led them to the door. This one, he said, though she might have doubled back and... No, May's grandmother said. She's down this hallway, I can feel it. Shall we? The older woman led the way, followed closely by the wolf. Jack brought up the rear, though he didn't allow himself a second to quickly kick the unconscious huntsman. Such a small thing, and yet it made him so happy. The hallway behind the door on the far right had a few doors on either side, yet May's grandmother bypassed them all, striding confidently towards the door at the far end of the hall. This door she threw open and marched through. The room beyond the door was an opulent suite, filled with every shade of red imaginable. from the bed linens to the cushy rugs and heavy drapes. And there was May standing in the middle of the room with her back to them. The princess was breathing hard as she whipped her head around looking for something or someone. "I know you're here," she yelled. "Jack," Eudora whispered, then gently touched him on the forehead. Instantly, the whole room brightened into a sort of hyper-focus for Jack. The reds of the linens and rugs, the molten golden orange of the flickering firelight, every color of the room grew so vibrant that it almost hurt his eyes just to look at them. And then Jack saw her, the red hood, invisible to the naked eye, stood right in front of the princess, preparing to strike. "May!" Jack yelled out. "Go left!" Without waiting for a response, Jack swung his bag up and launched it right at the spot May had been standing only seconds before, the spot where the red hood had just thrown herself. May hit the ground to the left, and the bag slammed into the hood, knocking her to the floor. As she landed, the hood's head bounced against the hard snow below the red rug with a loud crack, knocking her unconscious. May jumped back to her feet and turned to the door. "Jack," she yelled in surprise, "how did you—" And then she trailed off, finally noticing who was with him. "Grandma?" the princess asked in a very small voice. Eudora just smiled in response, her eyes glistening with tears. "Grandma!" May shouted, and threw herself into the arms of her grandmother, almost knocking them both to the ground. The two hugged and cried, each trying to talk to the other, but not making much sense through the flowing tears. Neither seemed to care at all that they were still in danger, or that they hadn't quite escaped yet, and Jack was hardly going to remind them. After all this time, May deserved her moment. For his part, Jack had to look away for a second to wipe his eyes. He caught the wolf looking at him, so covering his watering eyes by sniffing loudly. "Dusty room," he said, and the Wolf King just grunted. And then Jack heard footsteps behind the door to his left. "Jack," said a voice. Jack twisted around, prepared for anything, but fortunately found only Philip. The prince stood in the now open doorway, well, leaned against it actually, though he didn't look like he was in pain. Other than looking a bit pale in the face, in fact, the prince looked as healthy as the day they'd met. "Philip," Jack said, smiling widely, "look who we found." He stepped away from the wolf so Philip could witness the touching reunion of May and her grandmother. "Jack," Philip hissed, losing more color. The prince paused, licked his lip, and continued, "We have a very, very, very large problem." "I know," Jack said, moving to block the prince from May and her grandmother. They weren't going to be interrupted if he had anything to say about it. "We're not safe yet, but we can give them a minute, right? I mean, after all they've been through." Philip shook his head over and over. "It's not that," he said, still staring at May, his eyes wide open. I have to show you something." "What?" Jack asked, but Philip just grabbed his arm and pulled him back through the doorway. Before Jack could protest, the prince yanked him into an adjacent room, this one empty but for a stone table in the center, covered by what looked to be a large block of ice. Jack looked questioningly at Philip, but the prince just pointed at the stone table. Jack swallowed hard, then walked over to the table. The ice was too cloudy to see through, but there was definitely something inside it, something long and thin, almost like a body. In fact, the block of ice resembled nothing less than a coffin. "What?" Jack started to say, turning back to Philip, but the prince pointed down at a plaque on the floor in front of the stone table. Jack went down to look. "Poisoned by the wicked queen," he read aloud. "Here sleeps the fairest." Back at the door, Philip cleared his throat. "Jack," he said softly, "you told me." "Guys," May said from the doorway, her grandmother and the wolf at her side. All three entered the room and Jack stood up. Philip moved to stand near Jack, his face now as white as the snow walls. May immediately noticed. "Philip, what's wrong?" Before the prince could answer, the entire group heard footsteps coming from down the hall. The wolf stepped into the shadows to surprise whoever it was, while Eudora pushed her granddaughter behind her. A moment later, a tall, imposing woman swept into the room, her deep blonde hair longer than the woman was tall. Every conceivable method of tying that hair had been used in one place or another on the woman's head, yet it still ran down her entire body, past her feet, and back up again like an unending golden rope. The woman's thin body was covered by a luxurious gown of icy blue, while a circlet of white gold graced the very top of her head. Behind her in the hallway, guards drew their swords and prepared to attack. "I see you've escaped your cage, Eudora," the blonde woman said. "Oh no," Jack said, as every bit of energy, every bit of hope, every bit of happiness drained out of him like water. "Oh no, no, no." Apparently, iron shoes weren't enough, the woman said, her blazing eyes betraying her calm speech. "We'll be sure to do better this time." "Grandma, is that the wicked queen?" May whispered to her grandmother. Eudora smiled sadly at her granddaughter, and inside Jack died. He wanted to yell out, to warn May, to reach out and protect her from this. However, much as he wanted to, though, his arms and mouth just didn't get the message. Instead, he could only watch, absolutely horrified. "Grandma," May repeated. Eudora reached out a hand to brush an errant hair from May's face. No, she said, that's not the wicked queen, my beautiful little month of May. At least, not the way you mean. Surrender, Eudora, said the woman in the doorway. Step away from the girl and she won't be hurt. She's my granddaughter, Eudora said loudly to the woman, her calm demeanor disappearing for the briefest of moments. She immediately steadied herself, though, and the calm returned. She will be coming with me, Eudora said, quite evenly this time. What? May said, backing away from her grandmother. Jack, the blonde woman, everyone. What is going on, Grandma? She asked, her voice shaking. Please tell me. Hush, May, Eudora said, her attention elsewhere. The witch is not your grandmother, child, the blonde woman said, no matter what lies she told you. I am her grandmother, Eudora said, her voice rising a volume as the air around her sparked and sizzled, and she is my granddaughter. She will come with me. May looked from her grandmother to the blonde woman and back again. Finally, she turned to Jack. You know what's happening, don't you? She asked him quietly. He nodded in response, not knowing what else to do. May took a step toward him, her face a mask of puzzled concern. Jack, tell me what's going on, please. Jack licked his lips and tried to breathe. For a second, he thought he might not be able to, and he almost choked. But a moment later, fresh air spilled into his lungs. He sucked air in, closing his eyes as he did. Jack, May said, and he felt her hand grab his. I need to know. Jack opened his eyes again, though he found he couldn't actually look at the princess. I know you do, May, he said, staring at the ground. Your grandmother is the wicked queen. That is the end of chapter 41. See you tomorrow.